Oh, hello. So, earlier today, we had a conversation about John Locke and empiricism in Linfield College's Murdoch Hall Herbarium. And we were talking about the nature of empiricism. And at the end of that, I spent a little time, just a teeny bit of time, saying that a number of the ideas that were alluded to in Locke's philosophy but never actually addressed begin to be approached in David Hume. Well, it's David Hume I'd like to talk about now. And I'd like to talk about him here in a McMiniman's pub. Why in a McMiniman's pub? Why with the ambiance that we have here? Let me tell you why. And this is an important point. You know, Hume's ideas can be somewhat, depressing if taken in a certain way. Indeed, they can be a stone-cold bummer. And Hume himself recognized this. He recognized that his ideas, the nature of uncertainty that they would lead to, could create a certain despondency, to use his language. And yet, he said, when he felt this despondency, he would go to the pub, he would sit down, he'd order a beer, he'd play backgammon with his friends, and he felt better. And I think that that's telling. I think that that's important to what this philosophy is. So, what I want you to do is I want you to absorb the atmosphere here while we're talking about David Hume. I want you to take in this ambiance. I want you to take in the pub. I want you to have a Terminator right here. I'd like you to take all this in and enjoy it as we talk about the nature and the limits of what exactly human beings can know. This is a very subtle idea. It really is. I'm not just saying this. There's a lot of details that are involved with this stuff, and it can, if you take it in a certain way, be very, it can be depressing for some people, but it's not meant to be. It's actually meant to open up the possibilities for experience. It's meant to open up the possibilities for investigation, and indeed, in the best of all worlds, it's meant to lead towards a sense of freedom. So keep that in mind as we're talking about these ideas. So where to begin with David Hume? Well, let's start with a story from an episode of Saturday Night Live in 1976, starring Steve Martin. And Steve Martin plays a character in this story called Medieval Barber, and it's a skit, and it plays on sort of a soap opera type of theme, right? And in this, Steve Martin is the medieval barber who takes care of his community's problems. And the medieval barber, this isn't just in the story, this is historically, the medieval barber wasn't just a guy who cut your hair. He was your pharmacist, he was your doctor, he was your psychoanalyst, he was taking care of all of these things, right? So he's the center of the community with as far as people's problems go. So that's what medieval barber is. So Steve Martin's medieval barber. And because he's the medieval barber, and with all the drama and soap opera-ness that's involved with that, Steve Martin has to deal with people in drama, people in crisis. So he has this family come in, led by Jane Curtin, as a matter of fact, another great actress, who's the mother of this family, and they're wheeling in their father, and their father is sick, and he's delusional, he's crying out, and he's in terrible shape. And Steve Martin is calm and cool and collected, and he comes over to this guy, and he taps him on the head, and he kicks him in the stomach, and he does, I don't remember, a whole series of things to test him out. And then he says to Jane Curtin, "Well, no, I can take care of this for you. I really can." And then he looks at the camera, right, straight on, and he says, "You know, it's amazing. 50 years ago, we would have thought that this man was possessed by a demon or some sort of evil spirit, but now, thanks to the advances of medical technology in the 12th century, we know that this man has got a newt or a small dwarf living in his stomach." And everyone laughs because it's a really funny joke, right? Well, what's so funny about that joke? Well, the funny thing about that joke is that we know there's not a dwarf or newt or anything living in this guy's stomach. We know he's got some other sort of problem. And so we all laugh about that. Except, I'd like to ask you, and I'm asking this not as a doctor, because believe me, I'm not, especially in a class filled with nurses the way this one is. I'm asking this as a philosopher. What exactly is the way that we know that? I mean, we know that there's not a dwarf or a newt or anything else in this guy's stomach. And, you know, I'm not going to propose that there is. What I want to ask, though, is what is the way? What is the medium by which we come to know that? What is the medium by which we come to know that specifically, that is absurd? Because the great problem with this is, and the problem that we're going to see with David Hume, we don't know exactly what's absurd and what's not. Because the problem is, all we ever have to rely on is our own capacity to know. And given that all we ever have to know is our own capacity to know, we don't know whether we should be laughing like that at our own thoughts, or whether we should be laughing at the thoughts of the experts, or we should be laughing at something else entirely. We don't know. We're left in this state of indecision. And really, and this is where the subtlety of Hume comes in, all we have to do to see this is pay attention to the way that we think. The way that we think. So let me say a little about that. The way that we think. All right. Well, David Hume is an empiricist, like John Locke, and he's also a skeptic in the way that Descartes was, as far as what he adopts. So he is going to accept the idea that it seems as though our understanding of the world depends upon consciousness, but it also is something where it's not entirely clear that either reason or experience is enough to verify and define that our knowledge is complete and certain and necessary. Instead, what David Hume does is he looks at our knowledge and he asks, well, how is it that it seems to work? How is it that we find ourselves in a position to affirm or deny what we believe to be real, what we believe to know? And I mean what we believe to know in a real basic sense. You know, the way that we believe that gravity will always work, the way that we believe that there has to be some sense of cause and effect, the way that we believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. How do we know that exactly? What's the way that we come to know these things, right? And what Hume says is, well, if we look at the mechanisms by which we come to know these things, what we see is this. He said, what we see when we investigate our own thinking are two sort of modalities of our knowing. And these modalities are what he calls relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas, matters of fact. Now, what are these things? Well, let me start first with relations of ideas. Relations of ideas are for what Hume calls necessary relations of the structures of concepts in relation to one another. And what that means essentially is logic, right? So that there's a certain way in which ideas must fit in relation to one another, hence relations of ideas, that allows them to have any sort of coherence. And when we map out what those terms are, we usually find logic. So an example of a relation of ideas is if A equals B, and if B equals C, then A must equal C. Now you can see that. You don't have to experience A or B or C ever to understand this. You recognize that if these two terms, A and B, are equivocated, if B and C are equivocated, then A and C have to be equivocated under the terms I've laid down. This is an operation that has to occur. Or if A equals A and I assert an A, then one of the things I can derive from that is that there must be an A. Again, basic terms that we lay down as far as ideas go. Now here's the thing about this, and it's a important point that Hume observes. These relations of ideas, right, these basic terms by which, these basic operating conditions by which we relate ideas, as he says, these are absolutely certain. They are absolutely necessary. But in and of themselves, they're empty. If I try to have a conversation with you about A equaling B and B equaling C, so A has to equal C, I'll tell you, we're not going to get a date, right? It's going to be kind of boring. It's not going to get anywhere. Or if I say, hey, guess what? A equals A, and I have an A, therefore, what? A, again, not real interesting. It's not going to get very far. All these are basic operations that the mind has to do in order to establish ideas, but they don't tell you anything about the nature of the world. So where do you go to find out about the nature of the world, right? Where do you go to find out about how things are the way they are, why they are the way they are? Well, for this, Hume offers matters of fact, what he calls matters of fact. In fact, that's where the term comes from, a matter of fact. As a matter of fact. Now, what are matters of fact? Well, as the name would suggest, these have to do with things that we observe. And specifically, the way that Hume defines it is these have to do with propositions of morality or probability, as he says. This is his technical term for it. But what that means in 21st century English as opposed to 18th century English is issues that have to do either with facts that we observe, so up is that way, the sky is blue, the ground is beneath me, things like that, or issues of value. Always do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? These sorts of situations. Those are, in a broad sense, what Hume is talking about when he talks about matters of fact. Now, as you can see, matters of fact are interesting. Matters of fact is where it happens. Matters of fact, for Hume, is where the interesting aspects of life come about, both where we come to observe how the world as we understand it happens, how one day moves to the next day, moves to the next day, moves to the next day. It's how we come to understand values. It's how we understand good and evil, right and wrong, hope and despondency, right? Self and other. All of these things we come to understand through matters of fact because Hume, and remember, Hume's getting this from Locke, from the empiricist. He says what happens is we receive this experience, we judge this experience, and we make judgments about this experience because this is the way in which the mind comes to know things. I mean, how else is it supposed to do this, right? We take this experience in, we use reason to figure it out, relations of ideas, we assemble it, put it together, and we make assessments about the world. And that seems to make sense, right? Well, he says, it seems as though there might be a problem here. And here's what the problem is. Epistemologically, it has to do with the way that we hold matters of fact. think about how you hold a matter of fact. Right? So think about how you hold the idea that my shirt is a slightly off-white color, or my beer is a dark brown, right? Or that it's late in the afternoon, early evening, or any of these sorts of things. How do you assess that exactly? Well, the way that you assess that, the way that your mind comes to assess that, according to David Hume, is that you have to come from a particular point of view. You have to be you. Right now, sitting, and I suppose, I'm sitting here in McMinimans, you're sitting in front of your computer, but you're looking at the situation at whatever time and place you are, with whatever perspective you're coming from, with whatever background you have, with whatever judgments that you're bringing, with whatever sensibility you're bringing that forward. And you have to bring that forward. I mean, that's how the mind has to work. You have to have an assembly of ideas to bring this forward, right? It's not unreasonable to say that. We all do that. But what is that assembly of ideas in relation to the entirety of the possibilities of the ways in which to see this thing? You're looking at me right now. But how do you look at me from 360 degrees in every single angle, in every single way, in every single possible sense that you could ever see at all? And we're just talking about sight there. How do you see me, touch me, taste me, hear me? How do you bring all of that? How do you reflect on every single possibility that could ever be about me right here, right now, in this one instant in time? How do you do that? Well, obviously you can't, right? That's a God's eye point of view. And you don't have that. You have a point of view. And everything you understand comes from this point of view. But this is where we begin to get into what Hume's insight is. Every single matter of fact that you know, every single content, empirical content, experiential content, matter of fact, that you use to build an idea is coming with this narrow perspective. It's coming from this limited way of thinking about things. And it's not a condemnation of you. I mean, there's no, you're simply a being that has to understand, but you're a being that has to understand within the scope of what it is that human beings have to understand with. I mean, think about how puny we are. We have 5 senses, maybe 5, with which we're supposed to understand this, and every single possibility of this. We're supposed to look through space and time and every possibility of every single way with 5 senses. Talk about bringing a knife to a gunfight. That's worse than this. This is nothing. You don't have anything to understand with this. And yet, it's with that we begin to establish our sense of what we know about the world for Hume. And I'll tell you what, it's even more than that. Because with that, we also have, for David Hume, a sense in which we begin to establish the principles for understanding and reality. Remember, Hume is coming out of John Locke, right? He's coming out of this empiricism. He's coming out of this idea that everything we know, as far as contents go, we know through experience. And that which is beyond our experience, while we might hypothesize about it because of the experiences we've had, we don't actually know it. We can't demonstrate it. We're limited to the way in which we experience these things. Well, if you're establishing your sense of why the world is the way it is because of these experiences, think about what that means. You presume, and just so you know, I presume too, that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, right? You know that. You presume that. And if I ask you, just the way David Hume asked you, well, how do you know that? Precisely. How do you know? I mean, what's the reason that you think that's going to happen? You could say something like, you could say a few things. You could say, well, because it's happened every other day I've been alive. Or, if you wanted to get all sciencey on him, you could say, well, I'll tell you, David, see, I've taken these astronomy classes, and I know from observations made by a lot of other astronomers that the Earth revolves around the Sun at about 93 million miles in circumference, and it orbits around this, and it has the seasons, and it moves at a particular speed, and it has a particular velocity, and light travels in a particular way, and we see it reflecting in this particular sense, and as the world turns in its orbit around the Earth in the circumference, well, there you go. It gives the impression of the sun rising tomorrow, and because I know that's true, I know the sun is going to rise tomorrow. That's why I know it. And David Hume would say, well, that's very impressive, because he didn't necessarily know all of that. But he would ask, how is it logically that you would actually know the necessity of this being the case? How is it that you would know that these reports that were being given to you that were verifiable? And one of the things that you come down to with Hume, it's not just that you can't trust authorities. I mean, I suppose everyone learns that, amongst other things, in high school. It's that when you ask, how do people know things? If they know them through experience, they have to know that experience in terms of this profoundly limited scope, right? You know it in this way, in this time, in this place. The way I was saying that you know me right here, in this way where you can see right like this. And if that's the case, well, the very way that we come to know and think about the world is profoundly limited. It is absolutely limited. So that we're in a situation where our assessment of what we will call the real world it's not exactly in doubt in the way that Descartes would put it. In a way it's less, in a way it's more. It's less because he's not going to push the doubt, but it's more because he says, where is this built out of? What does this come from? Let me show you some of the places, just how far this goes for David Hume. Okay, I'm going to bring up three things that Hume critiques, just as far as this idea about relations of ideas and matters of facts go. Okay, first, cause and effect. Now you think about something like cause and effect, and you might say, well, I see things happen, I don't necessarily know what they are, I don't know what the cause was behind the effect, but I know that there had to be some sort of cause behind the effect. I'm sitting somewhere, I see an apple fall out of a tree. I see some young woman yell at her boyfriend. I see a cloud pass by in the sky. I see all these different things, and I think to myself, I don't know what caused that exactly. I'm not sure. I'm not enough of a physicist or I'm not enough of a psychologist to know exactly. But I know that there must be a cause, right? And you can say this all the time. And hell, this is something that we think all the time when we think about how the world occurs generally. As a matter of fact, when you got, and this is especially important to you guys who are asking about pre-established harmony, when you're talking about predestination, when you're talking about fate, okay? Big conversations that are going on the threads right now. The thing that makes those possible is that there is a cause behind those effects. Something happens, and if it happens because there is some sort of cause or some sort of force that is, to use language we will be anticipating here, because there is a condition for the possibility that makes it possible, that makes it come into being, right? And it has to be. There has to be some sort of condition for the possibility of this. That's a cause. So everything that happens has a cause behind it. It has to, it seems. Now, one of the things that Hume asks is a very simple, straightforward question with this. And what he asks is, how exactly, and I do mean exactly, how exactly do you know that? How exactly do you know that this effect is derived from some sort of cause? He's not saying from that particular cause. He means from a cause at all. And if you ask, well, how do I know that in effect, so the apple dropping out of the tree, the young woman yelling at her presumable boyfriend, the cloud moving from one space to another, how exactly do you know that that had some sort of cause behind it? And you say, well, because there had to be. Does that have to do with the situation? Or does that have to do with your own habits of thinking? And if you try to point to that, one of the things Hume's going to point at you, and make note of this and think about this, it's going to be hard to get, but take a little time to think about this, is that Hume says, I'm not sure how this could have to do with anything other than your habits of thinking. The fact that you presume that there has to be a cause behind effect, there has to be something that gives rise to the force that occurs, that doesn't have to do with the object. That has to do with your habits of looking at the object and thinking about the world around it. Now, I'll admit, and hell, Hume will admit, it's pretty hard to escape thinking about the world without cause and effect. It is. Absolutely it is. But the fact that it's hard to think about it doesn't change the fact that it seems to have to do with your thinking, not with the world. Think about that for a second. Just take a moment. That cause and effect doesn't have to do with the world out there. It has to do with your way of looking at the world. What you have, if you think about what you actually observe in the world, is one event after another event after another event after another event after another event. That's what you know as far as what you see empirically. What you believe you know is that there's a series of causes about it. And this series of causes, well, this can be very extensive. This can lead to all sorts of things like fate. This can lead to predestination. This can lead to pre-established harmonies. This can lead to all sorts of things. It doesn't change the fact. All of that has to do with you, or me, or Hume. It doesn't have to do with the reality. None of that is real. None of it. Logically. Pretty intense, huh? Well, let's go even further. Let's go into the realm of the self. Because after all, this is something that Descartes brought up, right? You remember when we talked about the cogito? Well, when we talked about the cogito, one of the things that Descartes thought was that he said, well, I can doubt all these other things. I can doubt the world of experience around me. Well, you got Hume there. He's totally on board with you. I can even doubt space and time and extension. Well, I can doubt that too. I don't think Hume's going to have a whole lot of problems with that either. And then Descartes says, but I cannot doubt that I am a doubting self. I cannot doubt that I am here as this rational entity that is capable of doubting it so that I know that I am. Cogito, right? Remember that. Okay, Hume's on board with that. But Hume says, well, maybe. But let's just think about how far this cogito goes. Let's just think about how far this self goes. He says, well, all right, do I remember myself when I was 4 years old, 7 months, 4 days, 3 hours, and 2 minutes old? And I'm just going to roll the dice and take a guess here, but say, I'll bet nobody out there remembers that. Well, how about when I was 12 years old, and 6 months, and 22 days, and 3 hours, and 5 minutes, and 31 seconds old? Remember that? And I'm going to roll the dice again and say, no. And I could probably go on, and on, and on, and on, and on. And I bet if you were to map it out on a big piece of paper, and you were to try to see how much of that you remember, I'll bet most of it, a vast majority of it, would be a big, solid goose egg, right? In other words, I bet most of what your life is, as far as what you can affirm, empirically, as far as what you can know was there and what you can have a sense of, is gone, vanished. What you have instead, says Hume, is you have a series of impressions right here and right now. That's what you got. A series of impressions right here, right now. And these series of impressions they come together and they sort of consolidate in the sense of where I say, well, this is what I am. I am Seth, or I am X, whoever X happens to be. Hi X, whoever you are, fill in your name. But I am whoever this is. Well, that's all right. You know, I can know that right now. But think about the limits of what that is. I am right here, right now, a bundle of sensations making an affirmation that I presume to make sense in the way that I use reason as I use it right now to make sense. That's pretty much what I can affirm. That's what I can know. And that's all I can know. Now think about that as far as knowing goes. Knowing suddenly becomes a real narrow, real limited scheme, right? That's pretty much what it is. We don't know much of anything. We can't know much of anything. So we don't have cause and effect with this simple investigation of the way in which we know things in terms of relations of ideas and matters of fact. We don't know that there's a self other than a bundle of sensations with regard to relations, ideas, and matters of fact. And, as a matter of fact, tee-hee, when we ask this question, well, look, I know something's real. You know what Hume asks with that? What do you mean by real? How do you come to know what the term real means? How do you know it? Do you know it because you have a habit of associations that you're in the habit of calling real? Well, that's reasonable. But that's reasonable in the sense that it's practical, not in the sense that it's logically necessary. That's reasonable in the sense of matters of fact, not in the sense of relations of ideas. Indeed, what we call the real world, what we supposedly know as real, is when we investigate the way that we know this stuff, profoundly limited. And this is a very important point to keep in mind for Hume, because there are all sorts of things that we would like to think that we know, and he's not doubting that we should operate within what we believe we know. He's going to allow that. He really is. What he's critiquing, what he's criticizing. And please keep this in mind, because this is what's important and useful about Hume, is what we can claim that we know dogmatically. You know, there are so many things in the world that we think we know because the way in which we hold it in our mind seems so certain. We're so comfortable with that. I know a lot of you guys out there, you are, well, you're religious. This is something that Hume gives a criticism of. You know, you can feel this knowledge, you can feel the presence of the divine in what you know. You can feel God. You can feel the rightness of this. Now, he doesn't have any problem with the fact that you feel these things. And he doesn't have the fact that these things are meaningful to you. But what he says is this actually knowledge? Is this actually knowing? And you might come around with the other side of this, and you say, well, you know, perhaps you're one of these hard-headed, hard-hearted, empirical, scientific types who would come along and say, no, well, of course not. It's all evolution and matter and science and all these sort of things. Except Hume comes along with the other side and says, yeah? Well, how do you, Mr. Science Man, know that? How do you come to know that? Not how do you know in the sense of you don't have any justification for it. He means how do you actually come to the process of knowing. That you've taken these classes, that you've done these tests, that you've been told that these tests mean these particular things, that you've read these books, that you've done these experiments. All of this depends upon experience, with the limits that we've already talked about earlier with matters of fact. All of it does. What can you know? Absolutely. What can you know as truth? And I mean know as truth. Truth is something that's so far away, it's far away like the horizon is far away. And you have to know that. You have to know that if you're going to be honest with what your knowing is. You have to know that as far as knowing the dogmas of science, the dogmas of religion. Because it is dogma. And this is something that Voltaire brought up too. It's dogma that gets in your way. It's accepting something as true that leads to the perniciousness, that leads to the bitterness, that leads to the vice, as Hume says, of human beings. Let me make something really, really clear here, because Hume says this at the end of his book chapter 12. Okay, this is important. If you haven't gotten to it, make sure you read it. One of the things he wants to say is, look, this is Hume talking. He says, I am not going to try to bring about absolute, unending doubt. What he calls Pyrrhonistic doubt. That's his term for it. But he says, I'm not going to bring that. I'm not going to say that you should doubt every single thing that you ever encounter, ever, in any way at all, ever. He says, first of all, it's impossible to do that, because no human being does that. And second of all, it's pointless to do that. He says, the reason I'm asking these questions, the reason I'm asking us to, engaging in this thought experiment, of how much can the human mind actually know about what it believes it knows, and what should it make of these qualities that it thinks is knowledge but amounts to habit upon analysis, is that we are in a world that is filled with these possibilities. I mean, just think for a moment how open the world is when the idea of cause and effect is questioned. Think about how many limits you yourself put on your mind because you presume, well, I'm gonna do this, so this is gonna happen. What he says is, you don't know what's going to happen. And you don't know what's going to happen because you have no knowledge. You have habits, and maybe you have good reasons for thinking this, and you do. Maybe every single time you've done this has happened. And practically speaking, that's the case. You know what? God bless you. This is how you get through the day. This is how you drive your car. This is how you raise your kids. This is how you pay your taxes. This is how you make sure things get done in life. And he's not having a trouble with this. This is why he's still in the pub, talking with these people. He's a realistic guy. But you gotta be careful. You gotta be careful about what that means as far as what you really know. The world's open as far as possible. And this is what Hume's showing us. And he's showing us in this subtle way just by looking at how we come to know. Okay? So think about it.